G'day guys, just got back from a barbecue and sort of after being out since this morning, we went it's Saturday, Australian Eastern Standard Time, daylight savings. Got up in the morning, went for a long walk at about 10:30 in the morning. Then sort of we went through Salamanca. It was quite busy. There was actually two boats in. It was a large cruise ship, and there was another sort of passenger boat that came in as well. So there's quite a few people in the city and in Salamanca. So that was quite interesting. Went around, did our own thing as normal. Then after that, sort of wandered back, had some coffees, barbecue, and then sort of just sat out in the sun. Been out there roasting for a couple of hours now since this morning. So just got back. It's about 6:44. Here it's still daylight because with daylight savings it's really technically 5:44 in non-daylight savings. So I sort of try to keep to that time in my mind. Like I even have a clock that's set to that. That's deliberate because just to keep for circadian rhythms, keep my mind synchronized to a different time to a non-Eastern. But you can't avoid it for work, but anyway, shit happens. And I was reading through some comments that people left and stuff like that, and sort of replying back to them and doing that sort of stuff. And I noticed one comment on one of my in the community page that I actually put in there, and I thought, I think rather than answering that one person, what I would make a video and actually tell you what I think and sort of my views about it. Whatever they whatever value people give them or whatever, that's their business. So I'll just share my screen. This was the comment that I in my community page that I put. Cheap. So this is me saying cheap energy has been masking this central bank money printing Ponzi scheme. Now it's coming to an end as we move back to a commodities-based economy. For more than 20 years, I've been telling people about the energy potentiality of the system, the economy. You can only keep growing the economy and the money supply with cheap and abundant energy. And that is the underpinning. Energy has always been the underpinning to produce goods and services. And if energy becomes expensive, the cost of goods and services and to do any activity, work goes up. And if the cost of work goes up, so do the end products, which means that is inflation. And you cannot mask it by money printing. All you do is exacerbate the problem. So, but with cheap energy, which we've had now since the Second World War, we had quite a bit of cheap energy. And that cheap energy that actually emerged in the US in the 30s and sort of grew. That's what grew America as a big global empire. It was the cheap energy that transformed that. And as I said, something the Walkie Brigade don't understand, and they're fully supporters, I should have said, supporters ignored. The BRICS and the East will still understand this. You can have, you can't, or it should have been can't. God almighty. God. Let me correct that. You can't have prosperity without cheap energy, something the arrogant Woke West forget. And where was the other part? And their foolish supporters ignored. Anyway, got to correct myself. Anyway. And this guy then asked the question in that regard: planned demolition of the world order. Celeste of Trend Research has stated that the 21st century is the Chinese century. My thoughts. Let me put it this way. The 21st century is going to be a much more complicated century than most people think. I don't think that necessarily that the 20th century is going to be necessarily a Chinese century. I think that the 20th century is going to be a very different animal completely. We're going to go back to an era like we had in the 19th century, where we had a lot of global powers, not one single entity. I don't think it's going to be the Chinese century, but it's going to be a multipolar world like we had in the 19th century, where we had the British Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, all these empires. Pretty much, America cannot sustain its global police duties, so to speak, and it will decline as a preeminent power. They can't even put a lot of people, sufficient people in the field. And most of the population in America have had enough of being the global police dog. Their cities are falling apart, their roads are falling apart, their bridges are falling apart. There's chaos in their cities. You go into New York or parts of California and other cities around the country, and you've got all these tent cities. The country's in a mess. There has to be, America needs to pull away from its globalized police duties. And what will happen is the American people will demand it. So, obviously having a rules-based order, global rules-based order, is a good thing for stability and trade and all that. But the reality is one country can't sustain it on their own. And while the Americans and the British before them, they did, let's say, have a heavy hand, and sometimes some countries can quite rightfully say that they were mistreated. And that's true. That is true. They also were a force that had some strong, values of, human rights and other things like that. They may not be perfect as societies. They have a certain level of corruption and a certain level of self-interest as well. But they've probably been the lesser of, compared to the evils of past empires in that regard. Let's not forget the British fought a long period of time, decades upon decades, anti-slave wars. There was no economic interest in it for them. They just had an ideological opposition to it. And so people forget about that, how many British died on the high seas fighting the slave traders. So, the thing is, and in the future, people will remember that, even though America did a number of wrong things, dictatorships around the place, toppled certain governments, became too arrogant, especially in the 21st century, the latter part of the 20th century, after the Soviet Union collapse. It became too arrogant. It lost its way. It thought it was the preeminent superpower on the planet, and started becoming too arrogant for its own, size, and started overextending itself. No different than the Western Roman Empire and many others in the past have done. The British Empire as well, overextending and then, nearly bankrupting themselves. So it is not sustainable forever. No empire lasts forever, and there will be a decline. But I don't think China, because China's got a number of underlying issues. One, it's got still, out of its 1.4 billion people, it's still got about 1 billion people that are not on the eastern seaboard, which is the other 400 million that are living very high living standards, like Western level living standards. They can fly overseas, they can, move around the world, where people, the other remaining 1 billion, are still, quite backward, quite, in rural areas, financially, still in a sort of early development stage. Now, Chinese government are trying to put money into those, trying to develop those regions, trying to develop, through the New Silk Road and stuff like that, initiatives. That's not only for their trade with other countries, and also their protection against the maritime powers, where they're trying to create land routes so they can circumvent if the West, the maritime powers, which is primarily the British and the Americans, try to, let's say, blockade the Malacca Straits and try to, cause some issues for trade movement to China, oil and, energy and other mineral resources. They're trying to circumvent that with land bridges through Russia, through Central Asia, into the Middle East and into Africa. So That's the strategy. And that's the reason why they've been working very hard on the Saudis, very hard on a lot of the Arab countries to have a better relationship with them. That's why the Americans got a very, a surprise, like Biden when he went to Saudi Arabia and other things. These countries just don't trust them anymore to the same level. And they can see that they are declining. They've gone all wokey and gone crazy and have agendas which just doesn't suit them. And at the same time, they've been following policies, these, mythical, solar panels and wind farm ideas, destroying their own economies and making themselves less efficient, less competitive, and less productive. And that affects also their asset values going forward. Declining population, all these things. These people look at that and they go, should I be investing in the US economy or in the Western economies when they're in decline? And these people don't seem to care that they're in decline. They've decided to basically do hurry-kiri on themselves and actually deliberately decline themselves. So that's what they're looking at of these countries, and China's exploiting that fact. China works with more in a very different way. We're not going to get China's not going to replace the US. China's not Russia. China's not Germany. China's not Britain or France or that. The Chinese don't waste their treasure in, let's say, adventurous wars around the world, trying to change regimes. They're not interested. They see that as a waste of energy. They don't want to make people Chinese. They just want to have deals. They just want to do business with them, have relationships with them. They don't care what their regimes are as long as they can have relationships. They think in a very, the funny thing is they really think in a mercantile way, in a very traditional capitalist mercantile way. Can I do business with this person or this country? So they're more interested in basically doing deals with anyone and everyone. And so it's a different, completely different strategy. They're trying to basically, if you want to stop China's growth, you have to limit its market access, which is very hard to do now because we're moving into a commodities-based economy. Because funny money doesn't count anymore. Really, the people that have got goods, the material to produce goods and services, because energy, food, and raw materials are what really counts in the coming century. And if you've got those things, then you can actually feed your people and produce products for your people and provide services at a competitive price. And you can sustain a certain level of productivity and prosperity. But you can't do that with expensive windmills and solar farms because of the deranged wokey ideology of the West. We've lost our way. We're putting the knife to our throat, and we're cutting our own throat because of ideological nonsense. This is what's happening. And the people in Asia, Africa, are looking at this and going, what is wrong with the West? They've lost their way. They are actually insane. They've completely lost the plot. They've turned on families. They've turned on faith. They've turned on everything. They've turned into nihilistic idiots and have lost their way completely. And they're just sitting there and saying, I don't want to be part of that. And they go, well, China's, one of those, they want to trade with us, but they don't want to tell us what to do. And they're less of, they're not going to impose regime change or anything like that. And so they're going, I could do deals with them without having any fear that they're going to come in and topple my government. So that changes the dynamics in geopolitics, because in the past, the geopolitics were, if you're part of the West and you support the West and you adopt some of the Western approaches and all that, you'll get benefits, financial benefits. Now that doesn't play anymore. They've seen how selfish the West can be. When the Asian financial crisis hit back in the 90s, America just pulled its money out, didn't care whether it was going to decimate the economies of Southeast Asia. Chinese came in this time when America was raising interest rates because of a lot of funny money printing and a lot of, poor economic management. And so it was pulling money in. They did the same thing, which affected the Weimar Republic back then in Germany. And they're doing the same thing to Europe now. by squeezing them in terms of credit. But some of these countries are going to China, and some of these countries are going to these sort of countries and saying, well, they're switching. Southeast Asia has just switched completely. The trade that China lost again in regards, the volume of trade that it has had with America pre-COVID, that same volume now it has with Southeast Asia. So large parts of that trade has been replaced. China did a strategic move to basically swap away from the US currency and the US market to Southeast Asia, shrank that part. And that's another reason why things have become very expensive in America, and the amount of product is reduced on the shelves. It's not accidental. It's because pretty much the Chinese are shifting away, and American manufacturing is really for decades has fallen behind, as Trump pointed out, and cannot keep up with this shift that's happening. And the Chinese, are not going to basically wait until they have trade retaliation against them from the US, which has lost its marbles, wants to take on everyone. It's got massive debts. It's a declining superpower. It's got massive internal problems. And at the same time, it wants to declare war on China and Russia. How crazy can you be? And so these countries are going, well, we're going to work differently. We're going to, countries that want to trade with us, don't want to boss us around, don't want to do that. That's where we're going to shift our interest. This is not me saying, oh God, how awful and all that. This is me giving you an objective geopolitical analysis. This is not me. I don't support, the Chinese regime. Don't support any of those things. I don't even support parliamentary democracy, which I consider a sort of an elected aristocracy. True democracy is direct democracy in my book, with constitutional protections for the citizens from majority, with an assembly that's controlled directly by the people in that regard. So it's a different model. I haven't explained it in thoroughly yet. I will be doing a manifesto at some point in the future to explain my views of how you would implement a direct democracy in the modern world, which will give power back to the commons and away from this sort of corrupt aristocracy that we've got today in particular. But that's for another day. In terms of China, where China's going to be, China's going to, let me explain one thing, an important thing that people need to understand. The reason why Britain became the preeminent power back then is due to cheap energy and productivity. They had coal, and they had the way to actually exploit that carbon energy, that cheap energy, with, coal-fired power stations. And they were actually able to create steam engines and stuff like that to produce that. And they were able to lift the productivity to tenfold. So for every worker working in Britain, they were able to get a productivity of tenfold. That means a smaller population could outcompete a larger population in terms of productivity, the production of goods and services. But back then it was a mercantile, so it was goods, the production of goods, and industrial goods in particular later on. So that gave them an advantage, a competitive advantage, which meant that they could outcompete larger nations with larger populations. Now, these larger populations, because of the Tibetan Plateau that provides a lot of silt and a lot of nutrients from the Tibetan Plateau to India and to China, which allows them to sustain big populations. When these populations use the same level of machinery and technology that we use, and there's more of them doing that, you don't not only have a similar level of productivity, but you also have a bigger economy in terms of volumetrics. So the volume, because of your sheer population, you're going to be bigger as an economy. And that bigness in terms of economy means you'll have more to be able to spend on military capabilities and influence as well. So as a consequence, countries like China and India are going to be the next global big powers, like France and France and Britain were in the past. That's the sort of world we're going to, and you'll pretty much get, if the Europeans get their act together and sort of unite with Russia and pull Russia away from China and create, from the Atlantic, and that was the German strategy, to Vladivostok, then they'll create another entity, and you'll end up with 4 major powers on the globe: a Euro-Russian conglomerate trading bloc, the Chinese, Southeast Asian, the Americas, which is America and the rest of the Americas, and India, sort of, and the region around that, which will be a smaller entity. It'll be more a national one, but those will be the 4 major powers of the globe, or regional conglomerates, or whatever that can emerge potentially. Europe, if it doesn't unite with the cheap resources and energy of Russia, it's doomed to basically massive decline in that regard. And it will basically end up being a bit like America will dominate them in the Americas, and it will end up a bit like vassal states under America. And then it will just be three entities, with Russia being a minor entity in a sense, and sort of gravitating towards either India or China. Hard to say where it'll end up, but then it'll be a 3-way tussle. The old societies with the big populations that can actually have massive economics, and you can actually see India is coming in, undertaking military training and military exercises with the Greeks, the Israelis, in particular the Greeks. They really want to have an alliance and a relationship with the Greeks because of Turkey and Pakistan issue. So they really want that sort of relationship with also Egypt as well. So there is a lot of that happening. They are, for the first time in their own history, where they've been more insular, starting to branch out as well, realizing that they need friends in this multipolar world. So, and that's why at the moment they sort of somewhere in between having a relationship with the BRICS, but also with the US. They are sort of measuring and trying to create new strategic alliances and relationships, in particular with Greece and the Israeli state at this stage, but also with a number of other countries in the Middle East and certain beyond that. So that's an interesting sort of pivot on India's part, strategic pivot at the moment that's actually happening, that many people have just not noticed it. The more thinking about their conflict with China, there's a bit more involved, and there's a bit more that most people are ignoring or missing completely. And then there's also a lot of investment into the Middle East as well. There's a number of the Arab countries, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, that are very much involved with a lot of projects and a lot of common economic investments with India. So there's a lot happening there as well. So there's a lot afoot, so to speak. I see it more as a multipolar world and less as a Chinese century, personally speaking. China, unfortunately, does not have it's got an aging population, a rapidly aging population, which they caused themselves. And so they don't have the same dynamism in terms of population that you need in that regard. They still have a large population, but they will shrink rapidly towards the end of this century and into the next century. So that's going to affect them to some extent. What they will become is a major global power, like Britain was in the past and France was in a part, but they won't be as aggressive as those countries. China plays a different sort of game. They try and actually create strategic partnerships, so they say, well, we'll work with you and we'll support you. You'll support us, we'll support you. And we'll stay out of your affairs, you stay out of our affairs. And that's very attractive to a lot of countries in the developing world. They look at that and they go, well, you know, we've had enough of the Europeans and the Americans pushing us around. You know, the Chinese seem to basically be providing us funds and trade and stuff like that without a lot of strings attached. They're less, they're less of a bully. So these countries are gravitating. You can see it. There's a lot of African countries, a lot of Asian countries that are gravitating towards China. It's not accidental. And that's what's worrying many in the West, because they can see it that, the countries that they thought they could rely on are not really there anymore. They're not really interested. They just want to provide prosperity for their people. And they look at the West and going, you guys are declining and you guys have lost your way. So you're not an example to follow anymore. China's a better example. So not that China's perfect, nothing like that. We're talking about how people are thinking, you know. So what I'm trying to explain is the sort of dynamics of geopolitics. I'm not, you know, as I said, I gravitate towards the more Western sort of traditional Western values, not the current wokey crap, but traditional Western values. And also when it comes to freedom and stuff like that, I very much love freedom and liberty. So I could never be supportive of regimes that have that as a lower value. You know, that's at the top of my value tree. So naturally, I would gravitate towards the traditional West. And it pains me and it saddens me that the West is basically doing this hara-kiri on themselves and destroying their traditions so fast and declining their importance on the world stage. And yeah, it's sorry and sickening at the same time. That's my personal opinion. You know, I think many of my subscribers have a similar opinion and view in that regard. But you know, there's many others out there that don't, and that's fine. You know, that's that's. I think I'm just being honest with you guys, telling you how I feel on that front. But also, I'm being, you know, objective when it comes to the geopolitics. I don't like seeing America not being able to field. You know, they can only actually put about 30% of their military into any theatre. That's 150,000. It's a joke. You cannot sustain that. Their military industrial complex cannot sustain. They're running out of ammo. They're giving so much to the Ukraine. They're running out of equipment. It takes too long. The industrial machine isn't set up for high sustainment warfare. Why the hell would you go into a war with Russia, you know, where it's to basically, you know, where you need a lot of equipment and resources? It's an attrition war. And you know what's happening? The attrition war, the Russians are winning. Because the West needs to export, has very little weaponry, because let's take it. The Germans ran down their tank units down to 400 tanks. The French did the same thing. I mean, in Europe, the only people that have got a lot of tanks are the Greeks with about 1,300. And, you know, the Polish that have got about 2,000 that are not too bad, and probably about 3,000 all up. A number of those additional ones being old and probably not even in operation, many of them. So that's the two countries that can only have enough tanks to basically defend Europe. It's a joke. It's a really bad joke on the state of affairs in Europe. So that it's, you know, and the only reason Greece has got so many and France and Poland have got so many is because Poland, since the fall of the Soviet Union, they've been scared of you know, Mother Russia, and the Greeks have been scared of the Turks, and they've been, you know, maintaining much higher military capabilities for that reason. Everybody else, it was kumbaya, like, you know, we were living in the 21st century and everything was nice and dandy. The reality was everything nice and dandy because America was spending stupendous amounts of money to patrol the whole planet and keep things sort of nice and dandy. You know, that's the only reason, and it's not sustainable, you know. And to try and build up the capabilities of defense capabilities in Europe is going to take a decade or more. So, you know, and you've got, for the US as well, you've got the Pacific Fleet, you've got the Pacific, requirements there. You know, you can't be wasting too much resource in one way and decline your capabilities. What if something happens in the Pacific? You know, what happens then? You're going to basically try and support another front in Taiwan, potentially. We know there's been recently a lot of equipment that's been moved to Taiwan and a lot of anti-ship missiles. I wonder who's got a very big navy in Asia, Northeast Asia. Is that? Oh, that's right. The People's Republic of China Navy. Yes. Say no more. So, and that's been happening a bit on the hush hush, but that's been happening because they're very concerned that China may move earlier than they think on the Taiwan issue. And let's not forget, for a very long time, they consider Taiwan as a province, and it's officially considered not a nation, but a province of China. So sort of a quasi-independent one, but still. So it doesn't have an official standing. So it'll be more like a civil war than an invasion. Couldn't be classified as an invasion. So could that happen? Potentially. So I think the Americans are a bit concerned to be moving so many anti-ship missiles to Japan. So there's a lot of foot at the moment. There's a lot of instability, a lot of tension around the world, and all sorts of things could break loose. That's the potential. So I think if we survive the next couple of years, we are heading towards the establishment of a multipolar world where we'll have these major conglomerate power groups. And depending on what happens in Europe, what sort of political parties emerge in Europe, Europe may shift away from the Americans, or you may have a break. Certain parts of Europe go closer to the maritime nations, which is Britain and the US, obviously, and Canada and Australasia. And then probably Greece will be one of those. France will be another if that was to happen. Now, about the other countries, hard to say. Some of the Eastern European ones, particular Poland, would definitely be Poland or Romania. The rest, hard to say where that. And the other ones may actually end up closer to Russia, potentially, and creating a sort of a Eurasian type conglomerate of one sort or another, trading bloc, or eventually that could emerge as a bloc beyond just trade. Hard to say. There's a lot that is happening at the moment. There's a lot of resentment in Europe. There's a lot of resentment in America and a lot of conflict in America. There's also a lot of tension around the world in a lot of countries. It's really hard to say how it's going to all play out. But also the Chinese have some internal problems themselves that they are dealing with, and they're trying to, through the Belt and Roads and that sort of initiative that they've got, they're trying to basically build some additional, you could say, trying to expand their sort of trade block. And this is why they're pushing for a BRICS currency to create a backed by gold, to create a more solidified block, which will give a lot of advantage to a number of those countries that are part of it. So yeah, and you've got emerging powers like in the Americas, like Brazil. So that's interesting. You can see there's a bit of a divide there. The left tends to be with America, the right tends to be with the BRICS. So it's hard to say how that's going to play out in the long run as well. So Brazil's going to be an interesting. They you could say are the most powerful Latin American country, and where they go will have a lot of influence on what happens in the Americas as well. So that's going to be very interesting. And I think there is a strong struggle between the Americans and the BRIC nations, in particular China, on that issue. Also, Argentina seems to basically be moving closer to China as well. That's very interesting. Recently, they've actually been talking with China to set up a military base, or a sort of a strange sort of base. It's sort of their Antarctic base, a base to support Antarctic sort of activities, but also has a sort of a quasi-military element to it as well. But it's very unclear what it really means. And the Americans are quite concerned. They've been putting shitloads of pressure on the British to stop their embargo, because Britain has got an embargo since the Falklands War on Argentina not to buy Western weapons. So wherever there's a British component in any weapon, they prevent it from actually being sold. And the Argentinians now are saying, well, if the Americans won't sell us F-16s, if the Americans won't sell us, allow us to buy Western weapons, we're going to look at China. And they are looking at the JF-17 fighter, which is, a fighter which has got some features which are very similar to the F-16. So they're definitely looking, especially the earlier block numbers, very similar. And the ones that were looking at are the early block numbers, I think block 20 or something like that, 15 and 20 of the F-16s, A's and B's out of Belgium that they were interested in. So that's a bit of a play there. And Britain is getting a lot of pressure from the US to relax those things. And, it's all about the Falklands, obviously, and they don't want Argentina acquiring certain capabilities. And, but it's forcing also Argentina to shift towards China in a sense. And also on the funding side, there's a bit of funding going in there as well. So it's an interesting play there. And the Americans are very concerned that they've got two big countries in Latin America, Argentina and Brazil, that are in play at the moment between them and China. So that's another, forget it. Venezuela, yeah, but Venezuela's not, it's got a lot of dysfunction. Maybe Venezuela in 10, 20 years' time, if they get their act together, then, and they bring in the Chinese to do some investment and sort of give them some know-how, and they take it on board and don't arrogantly think that they know better when they don't, then potentially Venezuela could become much more prosperous than it is currently. But at the same time, it's interesting because they've got a lot of resources. That's the reality. They just need investment and to stop doing some of the lunatic politics that they've been doing for some time now. That's another thing altogether. So there's a number of things at play. So in my personal opinion, I don't think that it's going to be the Chinese century, but I don't think America's finished either. But I don't think either that America is going to remain that preeminent power that it has been in the 20th century. That's all over. What we're heading is towards a multipolar world. Well, how exactly that's going to play out and what it's going to look like is hard to say at this point. All I can say is the key players are going to be China, Southeast Asia, India, and a few other countries that it actually has relation, and within the BRICS, and these countries also within the BRICS, and all that. Then it's, Russia with the Central Asian Republic seems to be gravitating towards China, but that could pivot back towards Germany if Germany changed direction. So that's at play. I don't know how that's going to play out. If, potentially Northern Europe could, and parts of Eastern Europe could shift easterly, as these politics of exacerbate. There is also cultural conflict in the West over the wokeness and stuff like that, and environmental policies and stuff like that. So that's going to increase the tension between the eastern part of Europe and the southern parts of Europe in regards to the northwest part of Europe. So there's another dynamic. So there's a lot of dynamics. Europe's up, parts of South America up for grabs, and Europe is up for grabs. Let's put it that way. The sort of centers that are going to be the kingmakers, so to speak, are going to be places like China, India, the US. So those three, and the other entity, Russia, playing a secondary role, depending on who it's going to create an alliance with. Germany as well, who it's going to create an alliance with. So sort of Russia and Europe are in big play. Where they're going to gravitate towards, very hard to say. That's going to be the big prize between the Chinese and the Americans. But both of them could lose that prize, potentially. And they could come together themselves, a Euro-Russian sort of alliance could emerge. So, and there are groups in Europe, in Germany in particular, and some in France, and even in Italy and Hungary and places like that, that have that that are gravitating in that direction. So that's a possibility, you know. So we could end up with 4 big centres, global centres, pretty much. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out at this rate. I would say that the 21st century is going to be a very interesting century. It's going to be definitely a multipolar world that is emerging and will dominate the global politics. But the exact alliances in the Eurasian sort of area and parts of South America, that's all in play at the moment. How that's going to play out, hard to say. You know, at the moment, Americans can only guarantee themselves, Canada, and Mexico within the Americas. Outside those 3 countries, things are a bit more fluid, and in particular, Brazil and Argentina at this stage. So it's quite interesting. That's my sort of view about, you know, my thoughts about the future of the remaining 20th century towards the middle. And, you know, I mean, I'm not stating that it is definitely going to play out there, but I think the main players, key players, and the main and the key importance of commodities are going to become more pronounced. So yeah, it's going to be, let's put it this way, an old proverb that actually originated in Britain, not in China. We live in interesting times. Yes, we do. I'll leave it at that. See yous. Oh, well, see us tomorrow, actually. I've got live streams that I have to set up. So, yes. So this will be posted on Monday. So, yes. But I'm doing it on Saturday. So, I better get the live streams up and running so you guys can see them. 7:30 at the moment. So, that's it. Hope you enjoyed it and got a bit of an insight in the way I sort of view these things. Anyway, next week, the week after, I'll probably do an analysis on what I think, how the Blitzkrieg war in Ukraine is going to play out. So, yes, and I'm trying to get some details and numbers on what are the stocks and what the West can supply and the supply chains, and, you know, so energy, how much can people provide energy to that war machine on both sides. So all these things are important, because you can have all the tanks in the world, you don't have oil to run them, they're useless. So there's a lot of those sort of things. I still haven't done the full analysis. Once I do it, I'll be putting a video, not next week, but the following week, on Ukraine, looking at some of the dynamics, you know, the real stuff, which is supply lines, logistics. Logistics win wars. You know, amateurs, they say, usually talk about tactics and strategies. While they are important, you know, professionals talk about logistics support. Do I have enough to be able to actually implement a strategy on the field? Anyway, I'll leave you with that. See yous.